Hey everyone, my name is Luke Eidenschink. I'm a traditional artist specializing in pen and ink illustration. And in this four-part video series, I'm going to take you step by step through the illustration process as I create this fantasy drawing. I'm going to be using all the materials that you see over my shoulder. So let's go through those materials in a little bit more detail, and then we can get started on the project. All right, so this is everything that I'll be using on this drawing. Quality paper is probably the most important part of any drawing, and I like to use the Strathmore Bristol. This is Bristol 500. They also make a Bristol 300. I use both of them. I especially like the 500 because of this super smooth plate surface. What that means for dip pens especially is that that pointed nib is going to glide on the smooth surface, much less likely to get snagged. And I also like the quality, nice thick paper that's going to hold a crisp ink line. That ink line is not going to feather out or bleed at all, as long as you have a good quality ink, which I have here. A couple different kinds that I like to use. I'll probably be using this Calli. It's a really nice jet black India ink, you can see here, but it really makes a nice crisp black line. I love it. This FW acrylic ink, also good. I especially like the fact that it comes in a big jug because, as you can imagine, I go through a ton of ink. So a lot of my drawings, I use a pencil to lay out a basic plan before I start inking. So I'm going to use a pencil, and the lines eventually do get erased when I'm done with the inking, so I have that eraser. And last but not least, of course, I do have a variety of dip pens that I will be using to apply that ink. So there you have it. Those are the materials I'll be using. Now let's get started. So we are back to inking on the wizard's cloak. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, my inking style tends to be one of more single layer lines. So I tend to not do a lot of building up of tone with crosshatching, at least not on the main subjects in my drawings. If I do use crosshatching and build up a lot of tone that way, it tends to be in areas where I'm trying to convey depth without sort of overwhelming with too much detail. So it's usually not the central focus of the piece. You'll see that I'll do that here on the sort of rocky outcrop that the wizard is standing on. I will make that a little darker and have more areas of cross-hatching and things. But for the cloak here, it's these nice long flowing lines to convey the movement of that cloak. Now, if I were to do a lot of cross-hatching on the cloak, I could perhaps convey a more subtle tones with that, but I would lose the movement. And for me, the movement is the thing that I'm looking for, especially in the central character here. And I do tend to go back in areas where I want to build that tone a little bit deeper. I will go back and build my lines up. So I'll start with a thin line and then make it a little thicker. For this reason, I don't use a lot of different nibs when I draw. Some people use a wide array of nib sizes on a given drawing. I tend to use 2 or 3 nibs at most when I do a drawing. And that's because I'm always going back and just using the same nib to build that line a little bit thicker, rather than using a different nib to make a thick line. It's all a matter of preference. So those lines, they're doing a good job of showing the movement of that cloak. And now you notice I'm using a little bit thicker nib here because I know that I'm making this rocky outcropping a little bit darker, so thicker lines. And I'll probably use a smaller nib in here as well. I think I go back and forth a little bit. Now, one of the important things about ink work is it's far easier to start with the foreground and work your way back into the drawing. Reason being that with ink, unless the foreground is solid black, it can be very challenging and difficult to ink your foreground over your background without having to go in and use a lot of white ink or white gouache to create the white spaces, if you will, between the lines. So I tend to work from the foreground into the background. Of course, when you do that, you have to kind of have the whole drawing planned out, which is what you saw me doing in the penciling stage, where I was kind of working out a little bit what some of the tones were going to be in the various layers of the drawing. So I know if, for example, I know that the foreground is going to be very dark, at least in contrast to the background, the middle background, and then the sky. So I'm making the foreground pretty dark, and then those next layers back will have to be a little bit lighter than this. And you can see me adding some interesting little areas of detail and texture with the nib. So with inking, one of the greatest strengths of ink is that you can, of course, show a lot of detail. When you are not working with color and you're just working in black, it does open up that possibility of having a lot of detail to come in. The downside of that is you can very easily overwhelm the eye with too much detail. So one of the tricks is you sort of want to imply the detail rather than actually have the detail. And where you can do that is just by creating areas of interesting combinations of lines and tones. They aren't necessarily showing every single crack in the rock or every single twist in the branch, but you're implying it. And you're just making patches of interesting texture that work together and contrast a little bit and add that interest for the eye. Making this little pouch on his belt, just there's an example of a little bit of detail that adds some interest, but it's not overwhelming. You can see that there's something there. It's on his belt. It gives the impression. As I believe I mentioned in the other video, it's all about showing a contrast between the different elements. So you're coming up with a language of lines to show the difference between this little arm guard on the wizard's forearm is a different material than the robe, and it's different from the staff and different from the rock that he's standing on. So you're creating this language of lines. I've got this kind of swirling lines of some sort of magic emanating from the staff. Again, another great way to show motion and movement in a piece. And this area inside of that energy will remain white. And I'll ink around it as I go into the background of the piece. And so that will stand out nice and be a nice contrast, foreground to background. And it'll draw the attention right to that white space. Pulling back, and there we've got our foreground and our main subject done. It's looking pretty good. So that's it for part 2. We continued the inking process and finished the foreground with the wizard. In part 3, we'll take on the dragon. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.